In the year 19 AD, 4,000 Jews were ripped from their homes in Rome and shipped to a remote Mediterranean island to die. The island was Sardinia. The crime? Being Jewish under Emperor Tiberius. The punishment? Forced conscription into mining brigades, battling bandits in malaria-infested swamps. Most of those Jews never returned to Rome. Some died in the mines. Some fell to disease. The Sardinian summer was brutal, the malaria relentless, and the bandits showed no mercy to Roman conscripts, but some of them survived. Against all odds, they adapted. They married. They built lives. They carved Hebrew letters into catacomb walls that you can still see today, 1,500 years later. For over a millennium, Jews lived on this island. Generation after generation, they survived the fall of Rome. They survived the Vandal invasions. They survived the Byzantine reconquest and the arrival of the Arabs. They built synagogues and businesses and communities that stretched from Cagliari in the south to Alghero in the north. And then, in a single year, all of it vanished. In 1492, every Jew on Sardinia was given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Convert to Christianity. Abandon everything your family believed for 1,000 years. Renounce the faith that had sustained your ancestors through exile and persecution and plague. Or leave. Lose your home, your business, your property, everything you'd ever known. Walk away from the land where your grandparents were buried and your children were born. That beautiful church right there in the heart of Cagliari, the Basilica di Santa Croce, it was built on the foundation of a synagogue. The same synagogue where Sardinian Jews prayed for generations before armed soldiers forced them out and their children were baptized against their will. If you stand in that church today, you're standing on ground that was once sacred to a community that no longer exists. But here's what nobody talks about when they tell this story. Sardinia wasn't Spain. The Jews of Sardinia hadn't done anything wrong in Spain. They hadn't converted and then practiced Judaism in secret. They hadn't committed any crime against the Spanish crown. They hadn't participated in any conspiracy or rebellion or heresy. They were simply living on an island that happened to belong to the same monarchs who decided that Jews had no place in their empire. Ferdinand and Isabella, the same Catholic monarchs who funded Christopher Columbus, who completed the Reconquista, who united Spain under one crown and one faith, the same monarchs who believed that religious diversity was a threat to political unity. The expulsion of Jews from Sardinia isn't just a footnote in history. It's the story of how an entire community was erased because of where they happened to live. It's the story of how religious fanaticism, political ambition, and human greed combined to destroy something that had existed for a very long time. But were they really nothing else but victims? Or were there actions that could not end up in any other way but expulsion of all Jews? It's the story of ordinary people caught up in forces they couldn't control and couldn't escape. And it's a story that most people have never heard. To understand why Jews were expelled from Sardinia in 1492, we need to go back. Way back. Before Ferdinand and Isabella. Before the Spanish Inquisition. Before the Crown of Aragon ever set foot on this island. We need to understand how Jews came to Sardinia in the first place, how they built their communities, and why those communities ultimately couldn't survive the religious politics of 15th century Spain. We need to start at the beginning. The story of Jews in Sardinia begins with an emperor who hated them and a decision that would haunt the Jewish people for centuries. In 19 AD, Tiberius Caesar ruled Rome with an iron fist and a suspicious mind. He was paranoid, isolated, and increasingly hostile to any group that seemed to maintain loyalties beyond the Roman state. The Jewish community in Rome had grown substantial, maybe 50,000 people or more, and Tiberius saw them as a threat. Not a military threat, a spiritual one. These people had their own God, their own laws, their own customs. They didn't worship the Roman gods. They didn't fully assimilate. And that made Tiberius nervous. A scandal involving some Jewish con artists who cheated a wealthy Roman matron out of her gold gave Tiberius the excuse he'd been looking for. The crime was real, but the punishment was collective. 4,000 Jewish men of military age were rounded up and conscripted into military service. Their destination? The island of Sardinia. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded what happened next, and his words are chilling in their casualness. These Jewish conscripts were sent to fight bandits terrorizing the Sardinian countryside. The island was wild, lawless, and deadly. If the Jews died in battle, Tiberius wrote, it would be no great loss. If they died of disease, even better. Sardinia would serve as a dumping ground for people Rome didn't want, and many of them did die. Sardinia was brutal in ways that Roman Jews couldn't have imagined. The summers were scorching, with temperatures that could kill a man working in the open. Malaria swept through the lowlands, carried by mosquitoes breeding in the swamps and marshes that covered much of the island's coast. The bandits were fierce and knew every hiding place in the mountainous interior. They had been fighting Roman authority for generations, and they weren't about to show mercy to Jewish conscripts sent to subdue them. But some of those Jewish soldiers survived. They learned to fight. They learned to endure. They developed immunity to the diseases that killed their companions. And when their service ended, why, they faced a choice that would shape the next 2,000 years of Sardinian Jewish history. Some returned to Rome. They had families waiting. They had businesses to reclaim. They had lives that had been interrupted but not destroyed. But others stayed. They'd spent years on this strange island. They'd married local women, had children, established themselves in communities that felt more like home than Rome ever had. Sardinia was brutal, yes, but it was also far from the political intrigues and periodic persecutions of the imperial capital. Here, a Jew could live quietly, practice his faith without interference, and raise his children in relative peace. The evidence of their presence survives today. In the catacombs of Sant'Antioco, off Sardinia's southwestern coast, archaeologists have found inscriptions from the 3rd and 4th centuries, Hebrew letters carved alongside Latin text, menorahs etched into stone walls, burial chambers that face Jerusalem, following Jewish tradition that the dead should rest with their feet toward the holy city. These weren't temporary visitors. These were people who expected to stay, who built tombs for their descendants, who created sacred spaces that would endure for centuries. For the next several centuries, we lose track of Sardinia's Jews in the historical record. The silence lasts nearly 800 years. But that doesn't mean they vanished. It means they lived quiet lives, provincial lives, far from the centers of power where history was written down. Sardinia itself faded from the attention of chroniclers as the Roman Empire collapsed and the Mediterranean world fragmented into competing kingdoms. What was life like for Jews in Sardinia during these silent centuries? We can only speculate. The island passed from Roman to Vandal to Byzantine control. Each change of rulers brought uncertainty, but also opportunity. Jews had long experience adapting to new political realities. They spoke the languages of commerce. They maintained trading networks that transcended political boundaries. They survived by being useful to whoever happened to be in charge. When they reappear in the records, it's the 14th century, and everything has changed. Rome has fallen. The Visigoths have come and gone. The Arabs have swept through much of the Mediterranean, transforming trade and culture. The Crusades have reshaped Christian attitudes toward non-Christians, and a new power is rising in the West, a power that would determine the fate of Sardinian Jews for the next century and a half, the Crown of Aragon. In 1324, Sardinia fell under Aragonese rule after a long and bloody conquest. The island had been controlled by the Italian city-states of Pisa and Genoa, but now it belonged to the Spanish crown. And for the Jews living there, this conquest would determine their fate for the next 168 years. Here's what you need to understand about the Crown of Aragon. It wasn't just Spain as we think of it today. It was a sprawling Mediterranean empire that included the Kingdom of Aragon in northeastern Spain, the Principality of Catalonia with its great commercial capital of Barcelona, or Valencia on the eastern coast, the Balearic Islands of Majorca and Minorca, Sicily at the toe of the Italian boot, and now Sardinia. At its peak, the Aragonese crown controlled trade routes from Barcelona to Athens. Aragonese merchants competed with Venice and Genoa for dominance of Mediterranean commerce, and Jews played a crucial role in this commercial empire. They were merchants who could trade in any port because they had family connections everywhere. They were bankers who could transfer funds across borders using letters of credit and trusted intermediaries. They were physicians trained in the Arabic medical tradition, which was far more advanced than Christian European medicine. They were tax collectors who could manage the complex finances of a medieval kingdom. They spoke multiple languages. They had trading contacts across the Mediterranean world. For Aragonese kings looking to expand their commercial influence, Jews were valuable assets. When the Aragonese consolidated control over Sardinia in the mid-14th century, Jews from across the crown began arriving on the island. Families came from Catalonia, where Barcelona had been home to one of Europe's most prosperous Jewish communities. They came from southern France, where the Languedoc region had sheltered Jews fleeing persecution elsewhere. They came from Sicily, where Jewish communities had existed since Roman times. In 1354, Jews even served in the Aragonese army during the siege of Alghero. Some are listed in the records as soldiers, fighting alongside Christians to conquer the city from its Genoese defenders. This wasn't unusual for the period. Jews in the crown of Aragon had more rights than Jews in many other European kingdoms. They could own property, practice their professions, and even bear arms in defense of the crown. These Jewish migrants brought with them skills that Sardinia desperately needed. The island was underdeveloped compared to the Catalan heartland. Its economy was based on sheep herding and small-scale agriculture. It needed merchants to expand trade, to connect Sardinian products to Mediterranean markets. It needed physicians to care for a population that had limited access to medical knowledge. It needed craftsmen to produce goods that the island couldn't manufacture itself. It needed financiers to manage the complex economy of a colonial possession, to advance money for royal projects and collect taxes from a scattered rural population. The Jews filled these roles. They became intermediaries between the Aragonese colonial administration and the local Sardinian population. They spoke Catalan, the language of the rulers. They spoke Italian dialects, the languages of the ruled. They understood Mediterranean commerce in ways that Sardinian peasants couldn't. They made themselves useful in ways that protected them, at least for a time. The community grew. By 1360, King Peter IV granted the Jews of Sardinia permission to erect a tower in the city of Alghero and to place a commemorative stone marking its foundation. This wasn't tolerance born of idealism. Medieval kings didn't think in terms of religious freedom or human rights. It was practical politics. Jewish communities generated tax revenue. Jewish merchants expanded trade. Jewish physicians kept the nobility healthy. As long as Jews were useful, they would be protected. In 1381, the Jewish community of Alghero built a synagogue. It was a modest structure, as befitted a small community on a frontier island. But it was theirs, a place where they could gather for prayer and study, where they could celebrate weddings and mourn deaths, where they could transmit their traditions to their children. The synagogue was enlarged in 1438, a sign that the community was prospering. A cemetery was established in 1383 and expanded in 1435 as the community grew and its members died and needed to be buried according to Jewish law. The Carcassonne family became particularly prominent. Originally from the French city of Carcassonne, they had migrated to the Crown of Aragon and eventually to Sardinia, where they became some of the island's most successful financiers. They loaned money to Aragonese kings throughout the 15th century. Samuel de Carcassonne and Jacob Cohen served as secretaries to the Jewish community, managing its affairs and representing it to the Christian authorities. In 1454, They received royal permission to emblazon the king's coat of arms on the wall of their synagogue. Think about that for a moment. A Jewish family so trusted by the Aragonese crown that they were allowed to display royal symbols in their house of worship. This wasn't a community living in fear. This was a community that had found its place. They were subjects of the king, loyal and useful, and the king, in turn, protected them. Jewish physicians became renowned throughout the island. Bonjudes Bondavin of Marseille practiced medicine in Alghero, treating Christians and Jews alike. His reputation drew patients from across Sardinia. Jewish merchants controlled significant portions of the island's coral trade, exporting the precious red coral that Sardinian waters produced to markets across Europe and the Middle East. In 1423, a Jew named Vidal de Santa Pau advanced money to city authorities to restore Alghero's defensive walls, a sign of how integrated Jews had become into the civic life of the island. In 1451, the regulations governing Jews changed in ways that seemed to favor them. They were exempted from wearing the Jewish badge that marked them as different elsewhere in Europe. This badge, usually a yellow circle or a pointed hat, was designed to humiliate Jews and make them easy targets for discrimination. Sardinian Jews didn't have to wear it. They could dress like their Christian neighbors, walk the streets without a visible mark of otherness. They didn't have to attend mandatory missionary sermons designed to convert them. They gained judicial autonomy, the right to settle disputes among themselves, according to Jewish law. They received tax exemptions that made their businesses more competitive. This was the golden period for Sardinian Jewry. 100 families, perhaps more, spread across Cagliari, Alghero, and Sassari, the island's 3 main cities, integrated into the economic life of the island, protected by royal authority, practicing their faith openly, raising their children in the traditions of their ancestors. But here's the thing about golden ages. They end, and the seeds of destruction were already being planted, not in Sardinia, but across the sea in mainland Spain. Because while Sardinian Jews were building synagogues and lending money to kings, something terrible was happening in the land their rulers called home. A wave of violence and hatred was building that would eventually crash over every Jewish community in the Spanish Empire. And that wave would reach across the Mediterranean and destroy everything they had built. June 6, 1391, the Jewish quarter of Seville. It started with a priest. His name was Ferran Martinez, and he was the archdeacon of Écija, a small town in Andalusia. For years, he'd been preaching that the Jews were responsible for every misfortune that befell Christian Spain. Drought? The Jews had angered God. Plague? Divine punishment for tolerating Jews. Economic hardship? Jewish moneylenders were bleeding Christian Spain dry. This kind of preaching was nothing new. Anti-Jewish rhetoric had been common in Christian Europe for centuries. But Ferran Martinez had something that other preachers lacked: persistence. He preached the same message, week after week, year after year, in every church and plaza that would have him. And he had timing on his side. King John I of Castile had warned him to stop. The king knew that attacks on Jews were bad for business, bad for social order, bad for his treasury. Archbishop Gomez Barroso had ordered Ferran Martinez to silence his hate, threatening him with ecclesiastical punishment. As long as these powerful men stood in his way, Ferran Martinez could preach, but he couldn't act. But then, in 1390, the archbishop died, and in 1391, King John followed him to the grave, leaving only an 11-year-old boy as heir. The Regency government that ruled in the boy's name was weak, distracted by political infighting, incapable of maintaining order. Suddenly, there was no one to stop Ferran Martinez. On the 6th of June, a mob descended on Seville's Jewish quarter. The violence started small, as these things often do. A few troublemakers, emboldened by months of inflammatory preaching, decided to put words into action. They threw stones at Jewish homes. They set fires. They dragged a few unfortunate Jews into the street and beat them. Then more people joined. And more. The mob grew until it became a force that the city authorities couldn't control, even if they'd wanted to. What happened next would change the course of Spanish history. 4,000 Jews were killed in Seville alone. 4,000 men, women, and children slaughtered in a single day. Their homes were looted, everything of value stripped away by neighbors who had lived beside them for years. Their businesses were destroyed, the workshops and stores that had been the product of generations of hard work reduced to rubble. Their synagogues were burned, the sacred scrolls and ritual objects consumed by flames or stolen by looters. And those who survived faced a terrible choice. Convert to Christianity immediately, right there in the streets with a sword at their throat. Kneel before a hastily summoned priest, renounce the faith of your ancestors, accept baptism, and live. Or refuse and die. There was no third option, no negotiation, no appeal. Convert or die. Many converted. What else could they do? They had children to protect, parents who were too old to flee, businesses that represented their entire life's work. They said the words the priests demanded. They let the water of baptism pour over their heads. And they became, officially at least, Christians. The violence spread like wildfire. Within days, it reached Cordoba, where another Jewish community was massacred and forced to convert. Then Toledo, the great center of Jewish learning in Spain, where scholars and rabbis who had spent their lives studying Torah were given the same choice as illiterate peasants, convert or die. Then the coastal cities of Valencia and Barcelona, where Jewish merchants who had traded with ports across the Mediterranean suddenly found themselves running for their lives. In Barcelona, the violence arrived by ship. 50 thugs who had participated in the Seville massacre sailed into the harbor, bragging about what they'd done. They told stories of the slaughter, of the looting, the forced conversions. They called on the locals to join them, to purify Barcelona as they had purified Seville. And on August 5th, nearly 2 months after the Seville massacre, they broke through the gates of Barcelona's Jewish quarter, known as the Call. The Barcelona massacre was especially devastating because Barcelona's Jewish community had been one of the most prosperous in Europe. They had been scholars who translated Arabic texts into Latin, making Greek philosophy and Arabic science available to Christian Europe. They had been cartographers who drew maps that sailors used to navigate the Mediterranean. They had been physicians who trained in the most advanced medical schools of the age. They had served Catalan kings for centuries, financing their wars and managing their finances. None of that protected them when the mob arrived. The violence followed a similar pattern everywhere. Mobs formed, composed of people from all levels of society. Nobles who saw a chance to cancel their debts to Jewish moneylenders. Merchants who wanted to eliminate Jewish competition. Peasants who had been told for years that Jews were the source of their misery. Criminals who saw an opportunity for looting. And ordinary people caught up in the madness, doing things they would never have done alone. Local authorities either couldn't or wouldn't stop them. Some city officials were sympathetic to the violence. Others were afraid of the mob. Still others calculated that it was better to let the violence burn itself out than to risk their own positions by opposing it. The result was that Jews across Spain were left defenseless, abandoned by the very authorities who were supposed to protect them. At least 400 Jews died in Barcelona that day, perhaps many more. The records are incomplete because so few survived to document what happened. Those who did survive often converted immediately, at the point of a sword, surrounded by the bodies of their neighbors. They had seen what happened to those who refused. They chose life, even if it meant abandoning their faith. Historians estimate that somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 Jews were killed across Spain in the summer of 1391. Tens of thousands more were forcibly converted at sword point. In a matter of months, the Jewish population of Spain was transformed. Communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed. Synagogues that had stood for generations were burned or converted to churches. Families that had maintained their traditions since the Roman era were scattered or forced into a new religion. These converts became known as conversos, new Christians. They were officially Christian now, baptized members of the church, obligated to attend Mass and observe Christian holidays and raise their children in the Christian faith. The massacres had achieved what centuries of missionary preaching had failed to accomplish: the mass conversion of Spanish Jews. The massacres of 1391 created a new social category in Spain. Before that summer, you were either Jewish or Christian. The boundaries were clear. Jews lived in their quarters, practiced their faith, and paid their taxes. Christians lived in theirs. The two communities interacted commercially, sometimes socially, but their identities were distinct. A Jew was a Jew. A Christian was a Christian. Everyone knew which was which. After 1391, everything was more complicated. Tens of thousands of people were now officially Christian, but had been raised Jewish. They knew Jewish prayers by heart. They remembered Jewish holidays from childhood. Their families were Jewish. Their instincts were Jewish. Their ways of thinking and eating and celebrating were Jewish. Only their baptismal certificates were Christian. They had converted under duress, at sword point, to save their lives. How sincere could such conversions possibly be? And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. You might think that conversion would have saved these Jews, that by accepting Christianity, they would have been welcomed into Spanish society, allowed to live as ordinary Christians, judged by their faith rather than their ancestry. But that's not what happened, not even close. The Spanish developed a concept they called limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. The idea was that Jewish ancestry was a taint that baptism couldn't wash away. You could be the most devout Christian in Spain. You could attend Mass every day. You could donate fortunes to the church. You could go on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. But if your great-grandmother had been born Jewish, you were suspect. Your blood was impure. You could never truly be a Christian, no matter how sincerely you believed, no matter how faithfully you practiced. This was something new in European Christianity. Before 1391, conversion had been considered a genuine transformation. A Jew who converted became a Christian, full stop. The church taught that baptism washed away all previous identity. But the Spanish developed a different idea, one that sounds disturbingly modern to our ears. They began to think of Jewishness not as a religion that could be changed, but as a racial category that was permanent. You couldn't stop being Jewish any more than you could change the color of your eyes. The conversos found themselves trapped between two worlds. The Jews saw them as traitors who had abandoned their faith under pressure. Even conversos who had tried to resist, who had converted only when the alternative was death, were regarded with suspicion by those who had chosen exile or martyrdom instead. The Christians, meanwhile, saw them as secret Jews, pretending to be Catholic. They had converted too quickly, too easily. Surely they didn't mean it. Surely they were practicing Judaism in secret, laughing at the Christians they'd fooled. The conversos had no allies, no protectors. They were too Jewish for the Christians and too Christian for the Jews. They existed in a social no-man's land, suspected by everyone, trusted by no one. Even success couldn't protect them. In fact, success made things worse. As conversos rose to positions of prominence in Spanish society, the resentment against them intensified. Old Christian families who had held power for generations found themselves competing with newly converted Jews, who were often better educated, better connected, and better at business. The conversos had the skills they'd developed as Jews, the trading networks, the literacy, the financial expertise. They rose quickly in fields where those skills were valuable, and the old Christians hated them for it. The same abilities that had made Jews useful before 1391 made conversos threatening after. A Jewish moneylender could be tolerated because he was a Jew, an outsider, clearly different. A converso banker couldn't be tolerated because he was competing with Christians on their own ground, taking positions that old Christians believed belonged to them by right. The result was a new kind of hatred, not hatred based on religion alone, but hatred based on ancestry, blood, origin, the idea that what you were mattered more than what you believed. This was racial anti-Semitism, though the term wouldn't be invented for another 400 years. It was the belief that Jews were fundamentally, biologically, irremediably different from Christians, and that no amount of conversion or assimilation could change that fact. And the worst part? Some conversos were doing exactly what the Christians suspected. They were practicing Judaism in secret, behind closed doors, in the privacy of their homes. They lit candles on Friday nights, as their Jewish ancestors had done for generations. They avoided pork, finding excuses for why they couldn't eat the dishes their Christian neighbors prepared. They observed Jewish holidays when no one was watching, fasting on Yom Kippur and celebrating Passover in hidden rooms. These secret Jews became known as Marranos. The word literally means pigs in Spanish, a deliberately offensive term chosen to humiliate. It was a slur, a term of contempt, a way of marking these people as neither fully Christian nor fully Jewish, but something unclean, something contaminated, something that had no place in proper society. By the mid-15th century, perhaps 200,000 conversos lived in Spain. Many were wealthy, having maintained the commercial skills of their Jewish ancestors. Some held positions of power in the church itself, becoming priests and bishops despite their Jewish ancestry. And the old Christians resented them bitterly. In 1449, riots erupted in Toledo against the conversos. In 1473, Córdoba exploded in anti-converso violence once again. The pattern was unmistakable. Every economic downturn, every political crisis, every social tension found its outlet in attacks on people of Jewish ancestry. The conversos had become the permanent scapegoats of Spanish society, and the Church had a solution, a terrible, comprehensive, merciless solution. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV granted Ferdinand and Isabella permission to establish a new institution in their kingdoms, an institution designed to root out heresy, an institution that would become synonymous with terror, the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was officially created to identify crypto-Jews among the conversos, to find the secret practitioners, to force confessions, to purify Spain of any remaining Jewish influence, even among people who had officially converted to Christianity. The Inquisition wasn't new. Papal inquisitions had existed for centuries, hunting heretics across Europe. But the Spanish Inquisition was different in one crucial way. It answered to the Spanish crown, not to Rome. Ferdinand and Isabella controlled it. They appointed its leaders, they directed its investigations, and they received its confiscated wealth, the property of those found guilty of heresy, which went directly into the royal treasury. The man placed in charge of this institution was a Dominican friar named Thomas de Torquemada. He was Isabella's confessor, the priest to whom she confided her sins and from whom she sought spiritual guidance, her spiritual advisor, and he was utterly convinced that the Jews and their converso descendants were a cancer eating away at Christian Spain, a disease that had to be cut out before it destroyed the whole body. Torquemada came from a converso family himself. His grandmother had been Jewish, a fact that was well known in the small world of the Spanish court. This might seem like it would have given him sympathy for the conversos, understanding of their impossible position. Instead, it seems to have intensified his hatred rather than tempering it. He became what the Jews call a rodef, a persecutor, the most dangerous enemy of all, one who knew his victims from the inside. He knew how conversos thought. He knew how they hid their practices. He knew what to look for. Under Torquemada, the Inquisition became a machine of terror. In its first year, 1480, more than 300 conversos were burned at the stake in Seville alone. 300 men and women tied to stakes, surrounded by piles of wood, burned alive while crowds watched. Their property was confiscated. Their families were destroyed, left destitute and marked forever by the taint of heresy. And this was just the beginning. The Inquisition's methods became legendary. Torture to extract confessions. The rack, which stretched the body until joints dislocated. the strappado, which hung victims by their wrists tied behind their backs, water torture, which simulated drowning, of anonymous accusations that the accused could never confront. You could be condemned based on testimony from witnesses whose names you would never know. Trials that presumed guilt. The burden was on the accused to prove their innocence, an almost impossible task when the evidence was secret and the judges were determined to find heresy. And there was a network of informants that turned neighbor against neighbor, child against parent. The Inquisition encouraged denunciations. It rewarded them. If you informed on a secret Jew, you could gain favor with the authorities. If you failed to inform, and your neighbor was later discovered, you yourself might be suspected of complicity. The result was a society of suspicion, where every converso family lived in fear that someone, anyone, might report them to the Inquisition. By the end of Torquemada's tenure in 1498, approximately 2,000 people had been burned at the stake. Tens of thousands more had been imprisoned, tortured, or publicly humiliated in ceremonies called autos da fe, acts of faith, where the convicted were forced to wear special garments and processed through the streets while crowds jeered. But here's what the Inquisition couldn't solve. As long as practicing Jews remained in Spain, the inquisitors argued, the conversos would have teachers, role models, people who could instruct them in Jewish rituals and keep their secret faith alive. A converso who wanted to practice Judaism in secret could visit a Jewish quarter, learn the prayers, receive the traditions. The Jewish community was a reservoir of knowledge that the Inquisition could never fully drain. The solution, on in Torquemada's mind, was obvious. The Jews had to go. Not just the crypto-Jews among the conversos. All Jews. Every practicing Jew in Spain had to either convert or leave. Only then could Spain be truly purified. Only then could the Inquisition's work be complete. And that solution would reach across the Mediterranean to an island called Sardinia, where Jewish families who had never set foot in Spain were about to lose everything. January 2nd, 1492. The city of Granada. After nearly 800 years, the Reconquista was complete. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs of Spain, rode through the gates of the Alhambra Palace. Behind them marched their army, tens of thousands of soldiers who had spent a decade fighting to conquer this last Muslim stronghold. Before them knelt the last Muslim ruler of the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Muhammad XII, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, surrendering his kingdom and his throne. The Alhambra was the jewel of Moorish Spain. Its walls were decorated with intricate geometric patterns, its courtyards filled with fountains and gardens, its halls echoing with poetry and music. For 2.5 centuries, it had been the seat of the Nasrid dynasty, the last Muslim rulers on the peninsula. Now it belonged to Ferdinand and Isabella. The Christian reconquest of Spain, which had begun in a small mountain cave in Asturias around 718 AD, was finally over. Every inch of the peninsula now belonged to Christian rulers. The Moors were defeated. Spain was whole. 800 years. Think about that. For 8 centuries, Spanish Christians had defined themselves in opposition to Muslim rule. Crusade against the Moors wasn't just policy. It was identity. It was the reason Spanish kingdoms existed. It was the story they told themselves about who they were and why they fought. Every battle was a holy war. Every conquest was a victory for Christ over Muhammad. And now that story had reached its conclusion. The last Muslim stronghold had fallen. The cross flew over every castle in Iberia. The question that loomed over Spanish society was simple but dangerous. What now? For 800 years, Spanish Christians had known who they were, warriors of Christ fighting to reclaim their land from the infidels. Now the fight was over. The enemy was defeated. What would hold Spain together? What would give it purpose? What would justify the monarchy's claim to absolute power? Ferdinand and Isabella had an answer: religious unity. Pope Alexander VI would soon grant Ferdinand and Isabella the title Catholic monarchs for their achievement in Granada. They had done what generations of Spanish kings had failed to do. They had unified Spain under the cross. But unification of territory wasn't enough. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted more. They wanted unity of faith, one kingdom, one crown, one religion. Here's what you need to understand about Ferdinand and Isabella's worldview. They genuinely believed that religious diversity was dangerous, not just inconvenient or unpleasant, but actively dangerous to the health of the kingdom. A state with multiple faiths couldn't be truly unified. Citizens with different religions would always have divided loyalties. God himself demanded religious uniformity, and kingdoms that tolerated heresy would face divine punishment. This wasn't just religious fanaticism, though it was certainly that. It was also political calculation. Ferdinand and Isabella had built their power by unifying Spain, ending the chaos of competing kingdoms and noble factions that had plagued the peninsula for centuries. Religious uniformity was part of that project. If everyone believed the same things, worshipped in the same way, followed the same religious calendar, they would be easier to govern. There would be no minority groups with separate identities, no potential sources of division or rebellion. The Muslims of Granada were protected, at least temporarily, by the Treaty of Surrender. They had been promised the right to practice their faith, to keep their mosques, to maintain their customs. Ferdinand and Isabella would eventually break these promises, of forcing the Muslims to convert or leave, but that lay in the future. In January 1492, the conquered Muslims were still theoretically safe, but the Jews had no such protection. There was no treaty guaranteeing their rights. There was no promise of tolerance, and the man whispering in the monarch's ears was Thomas de Torquemada. The Grand Inquisitor had a new demand. If the Inquisition was going to succeed in purifying the conversos, the practicing Jews had to be eliminated. Not killed, necessarily, just removed, expelled, made to disappear. As long as Jews remained in Spain, they would contaminate the conversos. They would teach them Jewish prayers. They would remind them of their ancestry. They would keep alive the very Judaism that the Inquisition was trying to extinguish. Torquemada had been building this case for years. He had compiled evidence of Jewish influence on conversos. He had documented cases where Jews had supposedly seduced new Christians back to Judaism. He had created a narrative of contamination and contagion, presenting the Jews as a disease that could only be cured by complete removal. On March 31st, 1492, less than 3 months after the fall of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella signed a decree that would change Jewish history forever, the Alhambra Decree. The text was clear and comprehensive. All Jews in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon and all their territories and possessions must convert to Christianity or leave. They had until July 31st, 4 months to abandon their faith or their homes, 4 months to sell everything they owned, to say goodbye to everything they knew, to uproot their lives and flee to foreign lands. The decree was comprehensive in its cruelty. Jews who chose to leave could take their movable property, but they couldn't take gold, silver, or minted money. The most valuable assets they possessed had to be left behind. They could sell their homes and businesses, but everyone knew they were desperate sellers. Christian buyers offered pennies on the ducat, knowing the Jews had no leverage, no ability to wait for a better offer, no choice but to accept whatever was offered. And here's the detail that would seal the fate of Sardinian Jews. The decree applied not just to Spain, but to all territories under the Spanish crown: Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands. Every Jew in Ferdinand's vast Mediterranean empire was affected. The wording was comprehensive. There would be no loopholes, no exceptions, no islands overlooked because they were far from the centers of power. The decree's authors had thought of everything. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, by the grace of God, King and Queen of Castile, Leon, Aragon, Sicily, Granada, Toledo, Valencia, Galicia, the Balearic Islands, Seville, Sardinia, named explicitly in the text of the Alhambra Decree, an island whose Jews had never troubled Spain, whose communities had been model subjects of the Aragonese crown, whose merchants and physicians and tax collectors had served their rulers faithfully for over a century. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Ferdinand ruled Sardinia. Ferdinand had decided that Jews had no place in his kingdoms. Therefore, the Jews of Sardinia must go. It didn't matter that they had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that they had served the crown faithfully. It didn't matter that their presence benefited the island's economy. They were Jews. And in 1492, that was enough. The Jewish community had one last hope. Their greatest leaders would negotiate with the monarchs. They would offer money, vast sums, in exchange for the decree's reversal. They would remind Ferdinand and Isabella of the services Jews had rendered to the Spanish crown. They would appeal to reason, to self-interest, to the very pragmatism that had protected Jewish communities for centuries. Don Isaac Abravanel was one of the most powerful Jews in Spain. He had served as Ferdinand and Isabella's financial advisor, managing the complex finances of the war against Granada. He had helped fund that war by advancing money to pay soldiers and buy supplies when the royal treasury was empty. He had connections at the highest levels of Spanish society. If anyone could change the monarch's minds, it was Abravanel. Abravanel had already fled persecution once. He'd been born in Portugal, where his family had served the Portuguese crown for generations. He'd served King Alfonso V until accusations of treason forced him to flee to Spain in 1483. Now, at nearly 60 years old, he faced the prospect of flight again. Another country, another exile, another life torn apart. But this time, he was determined to fight. Not with weapons, as Jews had no weapons, but with the only power Jews in medieval Europe possessed: money. Abravanel offered everything he had. 30,000 ducats, some accounts say, though the exact figure is uncertain. Others suggest even more. He pleaded. He bargained. He reminded the monarchs of the services Spanish Jews had rendered to the crown for centuries. He pointed out the economic damage expulsion would cause, the craftsmen who would leave, the traders who would take their networks elsewhere, the tax revenue that would vanish. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every Jewish community in Spain, for the thousands of families who would be uprooted by this decree. He was making the best case he could, using every argument at his disposal. And then Torquemada entered the chamber. According to legend, the Grand Inquisitor carried a crucifix. He threw it at Ferdinand's feet and spoke words that would echo through history. Judas Iscariot sold Christ for 30 pieces of silver. Your Highnesses are about to sell him again for 30,000. Here he is. Take him and sell him. The drama of this confrontation has been retold for 5 centuries. Some historians doubt it happened exactly this way. The story may have been embellished, dramatized, shaped into the perfect scene of religious fanaticism confronting practical politics. The crucifix may be a later addition, the dialogue a reconstruction rather than a verbatim record. But whether the crucifix was literally thrown or metaphorically invoked, the outcome was unmistakable. Torquemada won. The man who had devoted his life to purifying Spain of Jewish influence had achieved his ultimate goal. Not just the persecution of secret Jews, but the complete removal of Judaism from Spanish soil. Queen Isabella's response, recorded in contemporary accounts, was chilling. "Do you believe that this comes upon you from us?" she asked Abravanel. "The Lord hath put this thing into the heart of the king." This was the most dangerous kind of conviction. Isabella didn't see herself as a persecutor. She saw herself as an instrument of divine will. She wasn't expelling Jews because she hated them, though she may well have hated them. She was expelling them because God demanded it. How could she refuse God? When leaders believe they are doing God's work, there is no argument that can reach them, no appeal to reason or self-interest or compassion. They are beyond persuasion because they believe they are answering to a higher authority than any earthly power. The decree would stand. The expulsion would proceed. And in Sardinia, across the Mediterranean, Jewish families who had built lives on that island for generations were about to learn that their world was ending. Not because of anything they had done, not because they had offended the crown or committed any crime, but because a distant monarch, advised by a fanatical priest, had decided that Jews had no place in his empire. The Alhambra Decree was signed in March. The news traveled slowly in the 15th century, carried by ships across the Mediterranean, by messengers on horseback across the mountains of Spain. It probably reached Sardinia in April or May, giving the Jewish community perhaps 2 or 3 months to decide their fate. 2 or 3 months to choose between abandoning their faith and abandoning their home. 2 or 3 months to liquidate everything they owned. To say goodbye to neighbors they had known for generations. To figure out where in the world they could possibly go. The clock was ticking. To understand what was about to be lost, we need to look at what Sardinian Jews had built in their 150 years under Aragonese rule. Because what Ferdinand's decree would destroy wasn't just a population, it was a way of life. In Alghero, the Jewish quarter sat near the harbor walls, close to the sea that connected this frontier town to the wider Mediterranean world. The location wasn't accidental. Jews were traders, and traders needed access to the ships that carried goods between ports. The synagogue there had been built in 1381, just decades after the Aragonese conquest. By 1438, the community had grown wealthy enough to expand it, adding new wings, enlarging the prayer hall. On making room for a community that expected to stay, they added a mikveh, a ritual bath used for spiritual purification. A Jewish community without a mikveh isn't fully functional. Women use it monthly. Converts use it as part of their conversion. Brides use it before their weddings. The presence of a mikveh meant that Alghero's Jews could observe all the rituals of their faith without traveling to another city. They built a school for their children, where boys learned to read Hebrew, to chant the prayers, to study the commentaries on Torah that had been passed down for generations. Education was central to Jewish identity. A Jewish boy who couldn't read Hebrew, couldn't fully participate in religious life, couldn't be called to the Torah, couldn't join his voice to the prayers of his community. The school ensured that the next generation would be able to carry on the traditions of their ancestors. They established a cemetery in 1383, a place where the dead could be buried according to Jewish law, facing Jerusalem, with simple stone markers and no elaborate decorations. The cemetery was expanded in 1435, a sign that the community was growing, that children were being born, that the cycle of life was continuing. To establish a cemetery is to declare that you expect to stay. You don't bury your dead in a place you're planning to leave. They created a community that felt permanent, institutions that would serve not just the current generation, but generations to come, buildings that were meant to last for centuries. The Jews of Alghero were merchants mostly. They traded coral, one of Sardinia's most valuable exports. The island's waters produced some of the finest red coral in the Mediterranean, deep red branches that could be carved into jewelry, into religious objects, into decorative items that commanded high prices in markets across Europe and the Middle East. Coral diving was dangerous work, done by local divers who descended without equipment into the cold Mediterranean waters, harvesting the coral from rocky outcrops and underwater caves. The Jews didn't dive themselves, but they controlled much of the trade. They had the connections to buyers in Barcelona, in Marseille, in Naples, in Alexandria. They knew how to grade the coral, how to price it, how to transport it safely across long distances. Through their networks, Sardinian coral reached customers who had never heard of the island and would never visit it. But they weren't only merchants. Jewish craftsmen worked silver and gold, creating jewelry and decorative objects that blended Sardinian materials with techniques learned in the great workshops of Barcelona and Palermo. Jewish physicians treated Christian patients, their medical expertise valued above any religious differences. A doctor named Bonjudes Bondevin had come from Marseille to practice in Alghero, and his reputation drew patients from across the island. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe was largely based on Arabic texts, translated and studied in the great centers of learning, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews had collaborated before the fanaticism of recent decades made such collaboration dangerous. Jewish physicians had access to this tradition. They could read Arabic. They understood humoral theory and herbal medicine and surgical techniques that were unknown to Christian barbers who served as surgeons in most European villages. The community had their own judicial system. Disputes between Jews were settled by Jewish authorities according to Jewish law. This wasn't just a privilege, it was a necessity. Jewish law governed every aspect of life, from business contracts to marriage and divorce, to inheritance, to dietary restrictions. A Jewish community needed its own courts to function properly. But Alghero wasn't the only Jewish settlement on the island. In Cagliari, the capital, a larger community had taken root. The Jews lived in a neighborhood near the citadel, in the upper part of the city where the Aragonese administrators had their headquarters. They were clustered around their synagogue, close enough to walk there on Sabbath without violating the prohibition on travel. The tax collectors deserve special mention. Throughout the medieval period, Jewish financiers often served as intermediaries between rulers and subjects. They collected taxes that Christian subjects resented paying. This was both a position of power and a position of danger. The Jews had access to official authority. They could compel payment. They could call on soldiers to enforce their demands. But they also became associated with financial extraction, even when they were simply doing the crown's bidding. In Cagliari, families like the Carcassones managed significant sums on behalf of the Aragonese authorities. They loaned money to fund royal projects, advancing cash when the treasury was empty and collecting repayment later. They collected customs duties at the port, taking a percentage for themselves while ensuring that the crown received its share of every cargo that arrived or departed. They made themselves indispensable to the functioning of the colonial administration. The synagogue in Cagliari stood on a small rise in the heart of the Jewish quarter. Contemporary accounts describe it as modest but dignified. Stone walls thick enough to keep out the summer heat. Windows positioned to face Jerusalem, as tradition required. A Torah ark on the eastern wall that held the scrolls their community had brought from Catalonia generations before. In Sassari, in the north, another community thrived. Smaller than Cagliari, less wealthy than Alghero, but established and stable. And smaller groups lived in Oristano, in Iglesias, or in the mining towns where Jewish metalworkers plied their trade. But here's what made Sardinia different from mainland Spain. The violence that had swept through Iberia in 1391 hadn't reached this island. No mobs had burned the synagogues of Alghero or Cagliari. No forced conversions at sword point had traumatized these communities. The crypto-Jewish phenomenon, the secret practice that so obsessed the Inquisition, barely existed here. Sardinian Jews were not conversos. They were Jews, openly practicing their faith, attending their synagogues, observing their holidays without fear or deception. They had never been forced to convert. They had never had to hide their identity. They were exactly what they appeared to be. In 1451, the Sardinian Jews had been granted an extraordinary privilege. King Alfonso V exempted them from wearing the distinctive Jewish badge that marked Jews as different elsewhere in Europe. That badge, usually a yellow circle sewn onto clothing, was designed to humiliate and isolate. It made Jews visible targets for harassment and violence. It marked them as outsiders in every social interaction. Sardinian Jews didn't have to wear it. They could dress like their Christian neighbors, walk the streets without a visible sign of otherness. In an age when being visibly Jewish invited violence, this was no small thing. It was a sign of how integrated they had become, how valued they were by the authorities, how little the crown wanted to antagonize them. The Carcassonne family exemplified Sardinian Jewish success. Originally from Carcassonne in southern France, They had migrated to the Crown of Aragon and eventually to Sardinia, where they became some of the island's most prominent citizens. They were financiers who funded royal projects and collected taxes on behalf of the crown. They were advisors who counseled governors and administrators. They were members of the commercial elite, respected for their wealth and their connections. Generations of Carcassones had been born on Sardinian soil. They spoke the local language alongside Hebrew and Catalan. They knew no other home. When they thought of their ancestors' journeys, from France to Catalonia to this Mediterranean island, they probably imagined that the wandering was over, that Sardinia was permanent, that their children and grandchildren would live and die on this island, as they themselves expected to do. They were wrong. Between the spring of 1492, news began to arrive from the mainland. At first, it was just rumors, something about the fall of Granada, talk of new decrees from Ferdinand and Isabella, the kind of gossip that traveled with every merchant ship, half-heard conversations in harbor taverns, reports from traders who had recently been to Barcelona or Valencia. But the rumors grew more specific, more alarming. The Jews of Spain were being expelled, all of them, every single one. 4 months to convert or leave. The Sardinian Jews initially reacted with disbelief. Surely this applied only to Spain. Surely their island, peaceful and remote, wouldn't be affected. They had done nothing wrong. They had served the crown faithfully. They had built lives here for generations. And then the decree arrived. The Viceroy of Sardinia received his copy of the Alhambra Decree in the early months of 1492. His instructions were clear. All Jews must convert or leave by July 31st. No exceptions, no extensions, no appeals. The news spread through the Jewish quarters of Cagliari, Alghero, and Sassari like a cold wind. Everything they had built, everything they owned, everything they were, it all meant nothing now. They had 4 months to decide. Convert and stay, abandoning the faith of their ancestors, the prayers they had learned as children, the traditions they had maintained for 1,000 years, or leave and lose everything except their identity. It was an impossible choice, but it was the only choice they had. What do you do when everything you believe tells you that your faith is your identity, but everything you have built depends on abandoning it? This was the question facing every Jewish family in Sardinia in the spring and summer of 1492. And there was no right answer, no path that didn't involve sacrifice, no option that didn't require giving up something precious. The decree was devastating in its cruelty. Jews who chose to leave could take their movable property, their furniture and clothing and tools, but they couldn't take gold, silver, or minted money. The most liquid assets, the wealth that would be most useful in starting over somewhere else, had to stay behind. They had to sell their homes and businesses in a market where everyone knew they were desperate sellers. Christian buyers offered pennies on the ducat, knowing the Jews had no leverage. A house that had taken a lifetime to acquire might sell for 1/10 of its value. A business built over generations might fetch barely enough to buy passage on a ship. The Jews had no choice but to accept. The deadline was approaching. They had to take whatever they could get. Some Jewish families had spent generations building their wealth. Their homes were substantial, stone houses in good neighborhoods. Their workshops were equipped with tools and inventory accumulated over decades. Their trading networks connected them to partners across the Mediterranean. In a few months, all of it would be gone, sold for a fraction of its value to neighbors who knew exactly how to exploit their desperation. And even selling everything wouldn't guarantee survival. The sea voyage itself was dangerous. Pirates preyed on refugee ships, knowing they carried everything their passengers had left. These weren't government ships with armed escorts. They were merchant vessels, hired by desperate families, packed with refugees who had nowhere to turn if things went wrong. Disease spread in overcrowded vessels. Hundreds of people crammed into spaces designed for cargo, with inadequate food and water and sanitation. Illness could sweep through a refugee ship in days, killing the old and the young, the weak and sometimes the strong. Storms claimed ships that had nowhere safe to land. A Jewish refugee ship couldn't seek shelter in Spanish ports. It couldn't return to Sardinia once it had departed. If a storm arose at sea, the captain had to ride it out or find a foreign harbor that would accept him. Not all harbors would. Where would they even go? Some Sardinian Jews looked east. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Bayezid II, was welcoming Jewish refugees. The Sultan reportedly mocked Ferdinand's decision, saying, "You call Ferdinand a wise king. He is impoverishing his country to enrich mine." This wasn't just rhetoric. The Ottomans genuinely valued the skills that Spanish and Portuguese Jews could bring to their empire. Physicians who could treat the sick, merchants who could expand trade, craftsmen who could produce goods. But the Ottoman lands were far. Weeks of dangerous sailing across a hostile Mediterranean. The route passed through waters controlled by Spanish and Genoese ships that might not be friendly to Jewish refugees. And for families rooted in Sardinia, the idea of starting over in a foreign empire with a different language and culture was terrifying. The Ottomans spoke Turkish. They wrote an Arabic script. Their customs were different, their climate was different, everything was different. Others considered Italy. The Papal States had not expelled their Jews. Naples was still independent of Spain and still accepting refugees. Small Italian kingdoms might offer shelter. But these destinations were uncertain too. Local populations weren't always welcoming. They saw refugees as competition for jobs, as burdens on charity, as strangers who might bring trouble. And there was no guarantee that what had happened in Spain wouldn't happen in Italy eventually. If Ferdinand could expel his Jews, why couldn't the Pope? Why couldn't the King of Naples? Some chose conversion. We have to be careful here, not to judge. From the safety of 5 centuries later, it's easy to say they should have chosen exile, should have kept their faith at any cost, should have accepted poverty and danger and displacement rather than abandoning the traditions of their ancestors. But that's not how it felt in that moment. That's not the choice they experienced. Think about what conversion meant in practical terms. Your children wouldn't have to flee. They wouldn't have to endure a dangerous sea voyage to an unknown destination. They wouldn't have to grow up in a foreign land among strangers who spoke a foreign language. They could stay in Sardinia, the only home they had ever known. Your business could survive. Your customers were here. Your suppliers were here. Your competitors were here. Everything you knew about making a living was tied to this place. Starting over somewhere else meant learning everything again, building networks from scratch, all competing against established merchants who had every advantage. Your home would still be yours. The house where your children were born, the workshop where your father taught you his trade, the neighborhood where your family had lived for generations. You wouldn't have to sell it for a fraction of its worth to some Christian buyer who was barely concealing his satisfaction at your misfortune. You would still walk the same streets, see the same faces, live in the same world you'd always known. The mountains would still be the same mountains. The sea would still be the same sea. The church bells that marked the hours would be the same church bells, even if you had to pretend to listen to their message. Your grandchildren would grow up speaking the language you spoke. They would play in the streets where you had played. They would inherit the property you had spent your life building. They wouldn't have to start over in some distant land where no one knew their name. Yes, you would have to attend Mass, learn Christian prayers, eat foods you'd been taught were forbidden. You would have to let a priest pour water over your head and declare you Christian. You would have to take a new name, a Christian name, and answer to it for the rest of your life. You would have to lie. Every day, in every interaction, you would be living a lie, pretending to believe things you didn't believe, pretending to worship a God you didn't worship, pretending to be something you weren't. But some families convinced themselves this was temporary, that things would change, that Ferdinand would die, and his successor would be more tolerant, that the church would eventually forget about the conversos, that they could practice Judaism in secret, in their hearts, where no one could see. They would light candles on Friday nights when the curtains were drawn. They would fast on Yom Kippur and claim illness to explain it. They would remember who they were even if they couldn't say it out loud. They would whisper Hebrew prayers in the privacy of their bedrooms. They would teach their children, carefully, secretly, what it really meant to be a Jew. The Carcassonne family, that prominent clan we mentioned earlier, chose conversion. Or at least some of them did. They became Christians, at least officially. They kept their property. They maintained their position in Sardinian society. We don't know what they felt. We don't know if they mourned what they were giving up or if they saw conversion as a pragmatic survival strategy. We don't know if they kept any Jewish practices in secret or if they embraced their new faith completely. The inner lives of medieval people are mostly lost to us. They didn't keep diaries. They didn't write memoirs. We have only the official records, the baptismal certificates, and property transfers and legal documents that tell us what happened but not how it felt. But the Inquisition would eventually come for them too. Decades later, converted Jewish families in Sardinia would face investigations, trials, and accusations of secret Judaism. The Inquisition had long memories and longer reaches. Conversion, it turned out, wasn't an escape. It was a different kind of trap for those who refused to convert. The departure was agonizing. They gathered what they could carry. The Torah scrolls from the synagogue, the most sacred objects in their possession, the words of God written on parchment that had been read aloud every Sabbath for generations, family heirlooms that couldn't be sold, the candlesticks and kiddush cups that had been passed down from parents to children, clothing for the journey, food that wouldn't spoil, blankets for the cold nights at sea. They packed kettles and pots, the basic tools of cooking that they would need wherever they landed, prayer books and phylacteries, the ritual objects that would allow them to remain Jews in exile, as they had been Jews at home, the absolute necessities of survival, spiritual and physical. They couldn't take gold or silver coins. The decree was explicit about that. So they converted their wealth into goods that might hold value. Textiles, spices, anything that could be traded at their destination for the currency they would need to start over. They looked at their homes for the last time, the doorways their children had grown up passing through, the streets where they had walked to synagogue on Friday nights, the marketplace where they had bought food and sold goods and gossiped with neighbors, the view of the harbor from the rooftop, the garden where their mother had grown herbs, 1,000 small details that made this place home. The neighbors who had been their friends were now buying their property at a fraction of its worth. Some neighbors were sympathetic, sorry to see them go. Others were barely concealing their satisfaction. The Jews' misfortune was their opportunity. Some historians estimate that Sardinia's Jewish population in 1492 was around 1,000 souls. Others suggest it was smaller, perhaps a few hundred. The records are incomplete because Sardinian history from this period is fragmented, scattered across archives in Barcelona and Rome and Cagliari, much of it lost or destroyed in the centuries since. But even if it was just a few hundred families, that's hundreds of individual tragedies, hundreds of impossible choices, hundreds of lives torn apart. Each family had its own story, its own calculations, its own reasons for choosing conversion or exile. Each family had members who disagreed, parents who wanted one thing and children who wanted another, husbands and wives who couldn't agree on what to do. The children would have been confused. Why are we leaving? Why can't we stay? Well, where are we going? Will we ever come back? The parents would have struggled to explain. How do you tell a child that the place they were born is no longer theirs? That the people they trusted have decided they don't belong? That everything they knew is ending because of something called religion, something called faith, something they're too young to fully understand? And as the July deadline approached, those who had chosen exile made their way to the ports, to Cagliari, to Alghero, to whatever ship would take them away from the only home they had ever known. The synagogue in Cagliari held its final services. The community gathered one last time in the building where they had prayed for over a century. The Torah scrolls were removed from the ark, carried out carefully, reverently, want to begin their journey to wherever the community was going. The eternal light, the Ner Tamid that burns continuously in every synagogue, was extinguished. The prayers that had echoed in that space for generations fell silent. Outside, Christian officials watched. The building would soon be theirs. The Jewish quarter would soon be just another neighborhood. And the people who had made it a community, who had given it meaning and purpose and life, would be scattered across the Mediterranean, looking for a place where they could still be themselves. The summer of 1492 saw a tragic flotilla leave Sardinia's shores. We don't have complete records of how many ships departed or exactly where each family went. The bureaucracy of expulsion was meticulous when it came to confiscating property, but careless when it came to tracking the humans it displaced. We know from fragments of evidence that the Sardinian Jews dispersed across the Mediterranean, joining the larger exodus of Spanish Jews searching for safety. The departure itself must have been chaotic. Families loading their possessions onto ships, children crying, elderly relatives struggling to walk the distance to the harbor, neighbors watching from doorways, some sympathetic, some not. The sailors impatient to depart before the weather turned, or the authorities changed their minds about allowing passage. Some went to Naples. The Kingdom of Naples, still independent from Spain, was accepting refugees. The Neapolitan Jews had warned the Spanish Jews years earlier that Ferdinand would eventually turn on them. The Spanish Jews hadn't listened. I hadn't believed that their usefulness to the crown would fail to protect them. Now the Neapolitan Jews were proved right, and they opened their communities to the displaced, sharing their synagogues and schools and cemeteries with the refugees who arrived by the shipload. The journey to Naples was relatively short, a few days sailing under good conditions. But conditions weren't always good. The summer storms of the Mediterranean could be brutal. Ships overloaded with refugees, carrying everything their passengers owned, were vulnerable to rough seas. They sat low in the water. They were slow to maneuver. If a storm caught them in the open sea, they were in serious danger. And even when ships arrived safely, the reception wasn't always warm. Local populations worried about competition for jobs and resources. Refugees willing to work for low wages threatened the livelihoods of established craftsmen and merchants. Landlords saw desperate refugees as easy marks for exploitation, charging high rents for inferior housing. The Jews of Sardinia who reached Naples found themselves starting over with nothing, dependent on the charity of established communities. But Naples would prove a temporary haven at best. Within a few years, Spanish influence would force expulsions there, too. The Jews of Sardinia who thought they had found safety in Naples would have to flee again. The cycle of displacement that began in 1492 would continue for years, for decades, for generations. Each new home would prove temporary. Each new community would eventually reject them. The wandering that Ferdinand's decree set in motion wouldn't end for centuries, while others went further, to the Greek islands under Venetian control, to Corfu, where a small Jewish community already existed, to Crete, to Rhodes. These scattered communities around the Mediterranean became waypoints on a journey that, for some families, would take generations to complete. Some eventually reached the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul, the former Constantinople, capital of an empire that stretched from Hungary to Egypt. Thessaloniki, the great port city of the Aegean. Izmir on the Turkish coast. These cities became new centers of Sephardic Jewish life, communities where Spanish and Portuguese Jews and their descendants would maintain their language and traditions for 5 centuries. The Ottoman welcome was genuine, not just propaganda. Sultan Bayezid II saw the Spanish expulsion as an opportunity. The skills that Spanish Jews possessed were exactly what his empire needed. Physicians trained in the most advanced medical knowledge of the age, merchants with connections across the Mediterranean, craftsmen who knew how to produce goods that the Ottomans couldn't make for themselves. The Sultan sent ships to transport refugees. He granted them trading rights and religious freedom. He settled them in strategic cities where their skills would be most useful. The Ottoman Empire needed people, and Spain was giving them away for free. Thessaloniki became especially important. By the 16th century, Jews would make up a majority of the city's population. Sephardic refugees dominated the textile industry, turning Thessaloniki into one of the most important manufacturing centers in the eastern Mediterranean. They built synagogues and schools and hospitals. They created a new Jewish civilization in exile, a Sephardic culture that blended Spanish, Hebrew, and Ottoman influences. The Ladino language, a form of medieval Spanish mixed with Hebrew and local influences, survived in these communities into the 20th century. When you hear Ladino spoken today, in Istanbul or Jerusalem or New York, you're hearing echoes of the Spanish that Sardinian Jews spoke 5 centuries ago. A living linguistic monument to a world that was destroyed. But what about those left behind in Sardinia? The converts, the conversos, the people who had chosen to stay. After the expulsion, the Jewish quarter of Cagliari didn't simply disappear. The buildings remained. The streets kept their shapes. The homes where Jewish families had lived for generations still stood. But everything else changed. The synagogue was confiscated by the church. Within years, it would be demolished. And on its foundation, Christian builders would construct something new. A church dedicated to the Holy Cross, the Basilica di Santa Croce. If you visit Cagliari today, you can find this church in the heart of the old city. It's Baroque now, rebuilt and expanded over the centuries. The current structure dates mostly from the 1660s, redesigned in the ornate style that was fashionable at the time. But beneath those Baroque facades, beneath the Christian altar and the Catholic imagery and the paintings of saints and martyrs, lie the foundations of a synagogue. Stand in that church, and you're standing where Sardinian Jews once prayed, where they read from the Torah, where they celebrated weddings and mourned deaths and marked the rhythms of Jewish life for over a century. The building above is beautiful. The art is impressive. The architecture is worthy of study. It's also a monument to destruction, to the erasure of a community, to the triumph of religious uniformity over human diversity. The converso families who remained faced a different kind of challenge. On the surface, they were now Christians. They attended Mass. They baptized their children with Christian names. They participated in Catholic festivals and ceremonies. But suspicions followed them. The concept of limpieza de sangre that had poisoned life for conversos in Spain reached Sardinia too. People remembered who had been Jewish. Genealogies were investigated. Family histories were scrutinized. Accusations of secret Judaism could surface at any time, years or decades after conversion, ruining lives and destroying families. The Spanish Inquisition established a presence on the island in the 16th century, and among its targets were descendants of converted Jews. Trials were held. Evidence was gathered. Witnesses were called to testify about suspicious behavior they had observed years earlier. People were forced to prove that they weren't secretly practicing the faith of their ancestors. The Inquisition's methods were thorough. Informants in every neighborhood, records that tracked family histories for generations, a bureaucracy devoted to finding heresy even where it didn't exist. Some of these trials survived in archives. Names, accusations, confessions extracted under threat of torture. A woman accused of lighting candles on Friday nights. A man suspected of fasting on days that corresponded to Jewish holidays. A family reported for avoiding pork at meals, for changing their sheets on Fridays, for washing the bodies of their dead in ways that seemed Jewish rather than Christian. The evidence was often flimsy. The accused had little means of defense, and the consequences were devastating. Property confiscation, public humiliation, imprisonment. In some cases, execution. The Carcassonne family, those prominent Jews who had chosen conversion, appear in Inquisition records decades later. Investigated, questioned, their ancestors' faith held against them long after those ancestors had died. This is what religious persecution does. It doesn't end when the original victims are gone. It echoes through generations. It poisons family histories. It makes people afraid of their own ancestry. Some families succeeded in disappearing. They married into old Christian families. They moved to new cities where no one knew their history. They changed their names. They erased every trace of Jewish ancestry. Their descendants today have no idea that their great-great-grandparents were Jews who converted under pressure in 1492. But the story doesn't end with persecution and exile. Something survived, not in Sardinia itself, but in the scattered communities where Sardinian Jews found refuge, traditions, memories, identities that proved stronger than any decree or any inquisition. The communities that Sephardic Jews built in the Ottoman Empire and beyond preserved the culture that Ferdinand tried to destroy. They kept the language. They maintained the traditions. They remembered where they came from, even as centuries passed and their connection to Spain became more and more distant. And 5 centuries later, we're still telling their story. The years after 1492 brought a strange silence to Sardinian history. Where once there had been a community, now there was absence. The homes that Jewish families had built were occupied by others. The businesses they had run were taken over or closed. The networks they had created, the trading connections that linked Sardinia to ports across the Mediterranean, dissolved as the people who maintained them scattered or converted. The property transfers are documented in scattered records. Jewish homes sold at auctions for a fraction of their worth. Christian buyers who had waited patiently for this moment swooping in to claim bargains. As warehouses full of trade goods liquidated. Workshops stripped of their tools. Decades of accumulated wealth redistributed in a matter of months. The synagogue in Cagliari became a church. The synagogue in Alghero was demolished or converted. The cemeteries where generations of Sardinian Jews had been buried were neglected, their stones eventually weathering away or being repurposed for other construction. Within a generation, physical evidence of Jewish presence on the island began to disappear. And the records, the documents that might have told us exactly who these people were, where they came from, where they went. Many were lost, destroyed, neglected. The Aragonese crown had no interest in preserving the memory of expelled Jews. These were people who had been declared enemies of the faith, whose very presence had been deemed contaminating. Why would anyone want to remember them? Why would anyone preserve their records? The church had even less interest. The expulsion was a triumph in the church's eyes. The purification of Christian Spain. The removal of a stumbling block that had prevented conversos from fully embracing their new faith. Why memorialize the people who had been removed? And Sardinia itself, a remote island on the edge of European consciousness, wasn't a priority for anyone. It was a colonial backwater, important for its strategic position but not for its own sake. The internal history of Sardinian communities, Jewish or Christian, simply wasn't important enough to preserve. The result is a history full of gaps. We know the expulsion happened. We know communities existed in Cagliari, Alghero, and Sassari. We know some names, some professions, some fragmentary details. Scholars have pieced together what they can from surviving documents, from Inquisition records, from archaeological evidence. But we don't have the complete picture. We can't name every family. We can't trace every journey. We don't know which ships the refugees boarded, which ports they landed in, which communities took them in. The individual stories, the personal tragedies, are largely lost to us. What we can piece together comes from scattered sources. Aragonese administrative records that happen to survive, preserved in archives in Barcelona or Cagliari. Inquisition trial documents that preserved information about converso families, ironically saving details that would otherwise have been lost because the Inquisition was so thorough in its investigations. Archaeological evidence that emerged centuries later as modern scholars began to look for traces of communities that had been deliberately erased. The converso population that remained in Sardinia gradually assimilated. Over generations, memories of Jewish ancestry faded. Names that had once been recognizably Jewish were changed or disguised. Descendants of converts married into old Christian families, diluting the taint of Jewish blood that made them targets for suspicion. By the 17th and 18th centuries, there was no visible Jewish community on the island. The Inquisition's work, in its own terrible terms, had succeeded. Religious uniformity had been achieved. The diversity that had characterized medieval Mediterranean societies was gone. But here's what the architects of expulsion and forced conversion didn't understand. You can destroy a community. You can scatter its members across continents. You can burn its synagogues and confiscate its property and force its children to convert. But you cannot destroy memory entirely. Some traces always remain. In 1985, archaeologists made a remarkable discovery in the town of Sant'Antioco, off Sardinia's southwestern coast. In the ancient catacombs beneath the town, they found inscriptions, written in Hebrew and Latin, dating to the 4th and 5th centuries CE menorahs carved into stone, names that were recognizably Jewish. Burial chambers oriented toward Jerusalem. These weren't from the medieval Jewish community. They were far older. Evidence that Jews had lived in Sardinia during the late Roman period, perhaps connected to those 4,000 Jews. Emperor Tiberius had exiled there in 19 AD. The discovery revealed something profound. Jewish presence in Sardinia wasn't just a medieval phenomenon. It stretched back nearly 2,000 years. The Jews expelled in 1492 were not the first Jews on the island. They were the latest chapter in a much longer story, a story that extended back to the time of the early Roman emperors. And there's another trace that survived. Modern genetic studies have found traces of Sephardic Jewish ancestry in populations across the former Spanish Empire, in Spain itself, in Portugal, in Latin America, and yes, in Sardinia. The conversos may have publicly converted. They may have attended Mass and baptized their children and participated in every Christian ritual. But they had children. Those children had children. And genetic evidence doesn't care about religious conversion. Some Sardinians today carry DNA markers associated with Sephardic Jewish populations. They may not know it. Their families may have no memory of Jewish ancestors. 5 centuries is a long time, long enough for family stories to be lost, for traditions to fade, for connections to be severed. But the biological evidence suggests that the Jewish community of 1492 didn't disappear entirely. It was absorbed, hidden, diluted. But it survived. Fragments of DNA passed down through generation after generation, silent witnesses to an ancestry that was supposed to be erased. The erasure was never complete. It just took 5 centuries to see what remained. 5 centuries after the expulsion, how do we remember what was lost? For most of those 5 centuries, the answer was, we didn't. The Jewish history of Sardinia was a footnote, a paragraph in academic texts, something known to specialists but invisible to the general public. The synagogue foundations beneath Santa Croce weren't commemorated. No plaque told visitors that they were standing on the site of a Jewish house of worship. The streets of the former Jewish quarters weren't marked. Tourists could walk through Cagliari and Alghero without any idea that Jews had lived there for centuries. The expelled families were ghosts, unacknowledged and largely forgotten. This silence wasn't accidental. It was the intended outcome of the expulsion. Ferdinand and Isabella didn't just want Jews gone. They wanted Judaism gone. They wanted a Spain and a Sardinia where Jewish presence was unimaginable, where children would grow up never knowing that Jews had lived among their ancestors, where the very memory of Jewish contribution to Mediterranean civilization would be erased. For most of 5 centuries, they succeeded. But things have begun to change. In recent decades, historians and archaeologists have worked to recover Sardinia's Jewish past. The Sant'Antioco catacombs have been studied and preserved, their inscriptions photographed and analyzed, their significance explained to visitors. Academic conferences have been held, bringing together scholars from around the world to share their research on Sardinian Jewish history. Books have been written. Italian historian Mauro Ferrara has documented the Jewish communities of medieval Sardinia, recovering names and dates and details that had been lost for centuries. The Carcassonne family, the physicians of Alghero, the tax collectors of Cagliari, one by one. The individuals are emerging from anonymity. The silence is beginning to break. The story of Sardinian Jews has become part of a larger reckoning. Across Spain and its former territories, people are confronting the legacy of 1492. What was lost when religious diversity was destroyed? What would the Mediterranean world look like if the expulsion had never happened? These aren't idle questions. They're questions about identity, about belonging, about who gets to call a place home. They're questions that resonate today. In a world where refugees and migrants are once again being told that they don't belong, that their presence is unwelcome, that they should go back to where they came from. The expulsion didn't just affect the Jews who were expelled. It impoverished the societies that expelled them. Spain lost some of its most skilled merchants, its most accomplished physicians, its most connected traders. The economic decline of Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries has many causes, but the expulsion of productive minorities is certainly one of them. The Jews expelled from Sardinia scattered across the Mediterranean. Their descendants live today in Israel, in Turkey, in Greece, in the Americas. They may not know that their ancestors once watched the sun set over the harbor at Alghero. They may not know that their great-great-grandparents prayed in a synagogue that became a church. They may not know that they carry DNA from people who lived on a Mediterranean island 5 centuries ago. But the connection exists, and recovering it is an act of justice. We started this story with an island, a small community on the edge of a vast empire. A decree signed hundreds of miles away that destroyed everything they had built. The Jews expelled from Sardinia in 1492 weren't powerful. They didn't command armies. They didn't shape kingdoms. They didn't appear in the chronicles of kings and popes. They were merchants and craftsmen, physicians and tax collectors. The pattern of 1492 has repeated throughout history. A group lives for generations, sometimes contributing to their society, sometimes not, raising their children, building lives. Then a crisis comes, a plague, a war, an economic collapse. And suddenly that group becomes a scapegoat. Their differences, which were tolerated yesterday, become intolerable today. Their presence, which was accepted yesterday, becomes threatening today. We've seen it in the centuries since. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.